Okay, this is English 201, week 6. Right, week 6, part 3. Mr. Samsa, shouted the middle gentleman to Gregor's father, pointing, without wasting any more words, with his forefinger at Gregor as he slowly moved forward. The violin went silent. The middle of the last three gentlemen first smiled at his two friends, shaking his head, and then looked back to Gregor. His father seemed to think it more important to calm the three gentlemen before driving Gregor out, even though they were not at all upset and seemed to think Gregor was more entertaining than the violin playing had been. He rushed up to them. He rushed up to them with his arms spread out and attempted to drive them back into the room at the same time as trying to block their view of Gregor with his body. Sorry, I realized I got to underline something that I want to talk about that I didn't. I usually underline what I want to talk about. Um, uh, Usually I underline what I want to talk about ahead of time, and I just passed something that I think is really worth talking about. Okay. Now they did become a little annoyed, and it was not clear whether it was his father's behavior that annoyed them or the dawning realization that they had a neighbor like Gregor in the next room without knowing it. They asked Gregor's father for explanations, raised their arms like he had, tugged excitedly at their beards, and moved back towards their room only very slowly. Meanwhile, Gregor's sister had overcome the despair she had fallen into when her playing was suddenly interrupted. She had let her hands drop and let violin and bow hang limply for a while, but continued to look at the music as if still playing. But then she suddenly pulled herself together, laid the instrument on her mother's lap, who sat laboriously struggling for breath where she was, and ran into the next room, under pressure from her father, and ran into the next room, which, under pressure from her father, the three gentlemen were more quickly moving toward. Under his sister's experienced hand, the pillows and covers of the beds flew up and were put into order, and she had already finished making the beds and slipped out again before the three gentlemen had reached the room. Gregor's father seemed so obsessed with what he was doing, he forgot all the respect he owed to his tenants. He urged them and pressed them until, when he was already at the door of the room, the middle of the three gentlemen shouted like thunder and stamped his foot, and thereby brought Gregor's father to a halt. I declare here and now, he said, raising his hand and glancing at Gregor's mother and sister to gain their attention too, that with regard to the repugnant conditions that prevail in this flat and with this family, here he looked briefly but decisively at the floor, I give immediate notice on my room. For the days that I have been living here, I will, of course, pay nothing at all. On the contrary, I will consider whether to proceed with some kind of action for damages from you, and believe me, it would be very easy to set the grounds for such an action. He was silent and looked straight ahead, as if waiting for something, and indeed his two friends joined in with the words, we also give immediate notice. With that, he took hold of the door handle and slammed the door. Gregor's father staggered back to his seat, feeling his way with his hands, and fell into it. It looked as if he was stretching himself out for his usual evening nap, but from the uncontrolled way his head kept nodding, it could be seen that he was not sleeping at all. Throughout all this, Gregor had lain still where the three gentlemen had first seen him. His disappointment at the failure of his plan, and perhaps also because he was weak from hunger, made it impossible for him to move. He was sure that everyone would turn on him any moment, and he waited. He was not even startled out of his state when the violin on his mother's lap fell from her trembling fingers and landed loudly on the floor. Father, mother, said his sister, hitting the table with her hand as introduction, we can't carry on like this. Maybe you can't see it, but I can. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is, we have to try and get rid of it. We've done all that's humanly possible to look after it and be patient. I don't think anyone would accuse us of doing anything wrong. She's absolutely right, Gregor's father said to himself. His mother, who still had not had time to catch her breath, began to cough dully, her hand held out in front of her and a deranged expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister rushed to his mother and put her hand on her forehead. Her words seemed to give Gregor's father some more definite ideas. He sat upright, played with his uniform cap between the plates left by the three gentlemen after their meal, and occasionally looked down at Gregor as he lay there immobile. We have to try and get rid of it, says Gregor's sister, now speaking only to her father, as her mother was too occupied with coughing to listen. It'll be the death of both of you. I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have to and then come home to be tortured like this. We can't endure it. I can't endure it any more. And she broke out so heavily in tears that they flowed down her face, that they flowed down the face of her mother, and she wiped them away with mechanical hand movements. My child, said her father with sympathy and obvious understanding, what are we to do? His sister just shrugged her shoulders as a sign of helplessness and, and tears that had taken hold of her, displacing her earlier certainty. If he could just understand us, said his father, almost as a question. His sister shook her hand vigorously through her tears as a sign that there was no question. If he could just understand us, repeated Gregor's father, closing his eyes in acceptance of his sister's certainty I'm sorry, I got messed up there. If he could just understand us, repeated Gregor's father, closing his eyes in acceptance of his sister's certainty that it was quite impossible. Then perhaps we could come to some kind of arrangement with him. But as it is, it's got to go, shouted his sister. That's the only way, father. You've got to get rid of the idea that that's Gregor. We've only harmed ourselves by believing it for so long. How can that be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it is not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and he would have gone of his own free will. We wouldn't have a brother anymore then, but we could carry on with our lives and remember him with respect. As it is, this animal is persecuting us. It's driven out our tenants. It obviously wants to take over the whole flat and force us to sleep on the streets. Father, just look, she suddenly screamed. He's starting again. In her alarm, which was totally beyond Gregor's comprehension, his sister even abandoned his mother as he pushed himself vigorously out of her chair. His sister even abandoned his mother as she pushed herself vigorously out of her chair, as if more willing to sacrifice her own mother than stay anywhere near Gregor. She rushed out behind her father, who had become excited merely because she was, and stood up, half raising his hands in front of Gregor's sister, as if to protect her. But Gregor had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. All he had done was begin to turn around so he could go back into his room, although that was in itself quite startling, as his pain-racked condition meant that turning round required a great deal of effort, and he was using his head to help himself do it, repeatedly raising it and striking it against the floor. He stopped and looked round. They seemed to have realized his good intention and had only been alarmed briefly. Now they all looked at him in unhappy silence. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed against each other, her eyes nearly closed with exhaustion. His sister sat next to his father with her arms around his neck. Maybe now they'll let me turn around, thought Gregor, and went back to work. He could not help panting loudly with the effort, and had sometimes to stop and take rest. No one was making him rush anymore. Everything was left up to him. As soon as he had finally finished turning around, he began to move straight ahead. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from his room, and he could not understand how he covered that distance in his weak state a little while before, almost without noticing it. He concentrated on crawling as fast as he could, and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not any cry from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he reached the doorway. He did not turn it all the way round as he felt his neck becoming stiff, but it was nonetheless enough to see that nothing behind him has changed, only his sister had stood up. With his last glance, he saw that his mother had now fallen completely asleep. He was hardly inside his room before the door was hurriedly shut, bolted, and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed under him. It was his sister who had been in so much of a rush. She had been standing there, waiting, and sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming at all, and as she turned the key in the lock, she said loudly to her parents, "At last." How am I doing on time? Sorry, I gotta check the time. Okay. What now, then? Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather that being able to actually move around on those spindly legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It's true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker and would finally disappear altogether. He could already hardly feel the decayed apple in his back or the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. He thought back of his family with emotion and love. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning. He watched it as he watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. I'm gonna finish this soon. Almost done. Gregor's dead. All right.